Hello, this is a talk called The Great Conundrum about the peekaboo God. The Great Conundrum, the peekaboo God. And it's for people like me who are interested in riddles. And this talk centers around a big question I've always been asking myself, and some of you may have also been asking yourselves, and it's this. If divinity lies inside us, if it's agreed that who you and I are is a soul, if soulness is our core, our true birthright, the true us, then why do we, A, forget this, and B, why does it seem so hard for us to discover this? In fact, with many of us going through our entire lives and living and dying without ever discovering this. In other words, why does this knowledge of who you and I truly are, why does it have to be hidden? One of the effects being that it's more difficult for us to behave in soulful ways because we don't know that we are loving souls and that compassion and wisdom is built into the way that we truly are. In other words, why do we all seem to lose sight of who we are and come to believe that who we are is our separative ego self, i.e., our ideas about ourselves, which, folks, ain't who we are? Why is it all so difficult and complicated? Why can't we just know from the start that we are a soul, that we are one with divinity? Why do we have to work at becoming what we already are? In other words, why do we seem to be so deeply manacled into our stories about separation and suffering? So much so that many of us live our entire lives without ever managing to slip free of those chains. One can certainly understand why ideas around our deserving to be punished or a man being a wretched sinner falling from grace have a following, because it really does seem as if we're being punished for being sinners, for not being good enough as Jesus was good enough, as those evangelical Christians like to tell us, i.e. that we're wretched, fallen sinners after all. Are we? No. I don't think so, and I'm sure that is not so. But these are important questions to ask. Why does it seem as if we've fallen out of grace through the act of being born? The poet Wordsworth also asked this question, and in his great poem, Imitations of Immortality, he asks, why is it that in order for us to develop, that we human beings seem to need to move further and further away from that soulfulness that we were so close to when we first entered the world as a newborn? Question he asks, whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream? This is in his poem, Intimations to Immortality. But he gives an answer to this question. Here's what Wordsworth says. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life star, hath had elsewhere its setting. But trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. And then he gets to the point. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. But he beholds the light and whence it flows. He sees it in his joy. At length the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. What Wordsworth seems to be referring to is what I call the soul wound that afflicts not just some of us, but most of us. He's suggesting that when we first come into the world, when we're newly born, we all still exude the warm, soulful, womb-like connection with divine beingness that's the core of who we are, albeit we don't experience this consciously because we haven't yet become a person. So we have a pre-personal experience of unity, where inside our mother's womb, we feel we're still part of her. But then instead of our being able to evolve from that place, what happens is that we need to separate from our mother. And this occurs by our gradually growing away from or distancing ourselves from that heaven or womb-like unity that was about us in our infancy. In other words, the experience of being an integral part of womb-like soulfulness, even if we haven't yet experienced it consciously, because we can't, because we don't yet have any consciousness, it disappears. In other words, to embark on the journey of becoming who we really are, we have to forget where we came from. And how Wordsworth puts it is that shades of the prison house close around the growing child. In other words, the conditioning of the society around us closes around us and gradually muffles out our unitive memories. And this is even more the case if our parents or caregivers are not connected to their own soul nature and therefore are unable to reflect or mirror anything soulful back to us, and consequently can do nothing to help keep alive the rapidly vanishing memories of when we felt, albeit in a pre-personal way, our belongingness to or our connectedness with all of life. Whew. Yes. I'll explain this slightly differently. We need to separate from our mamas if we're to become a person in our own right, because initially we're bonded so close that we don't know that we are not her. In other words, growing up requires that we all have to go through both the separation from our mothers and an ego-growing stage where we are called to enter the worlds of separation. And for this to occur, it's necessary that we forget that oceanic womb-like oneness that we once felt. However, this is not to be seen as a fall or a punishment because we're bad or sinful, as certain Christians think, but it's needed because it sets up the necessary conditions for the adventure of our potentially becoming a real human being, i.e., forgetting our origins or forgetting where we came from is a natural part of our development. And to grow up requires that we distance ourselves from that unity of awareness, or what Wordsworth describes as God who is our home. So this disconnectedness from the light that was around us as a tiny baby is not a sign of something necessarily having gone wrong, but rather is an integral part of our evolutionary process. In other words, being born is not a fall from grace. But it's a case that in order to individuate and discover ourselves as a person, our grace or our soul, or the deeper us or the divine us, whatever we want to call it, needs to hide from us, or more accurately, hide inside us. So who you and I truly are is hidden inside us. Because the game of life is set up to see if during the course of our lives, are we going to be moved to find this sacred us hidden inside us? Or are we going to remain in our separate ego self all our lives? As T.S. Eliot said, are we going to know the place for the first time? i.e., wake up and see that we've always been one with divine consciousness. What I see it is that this is the spiritual game that the cosmos sets up for us. Do you get it? Higher power, or the universal intelligence, or the force, is wanting to test us. And to that end, hides inside us intentionally, but gives us little hints from time to time that it is hidden and that there is something else. Because it's part of the game that it sets up. It's kind of like a hide and seek game. The divine is hidden inside us. Are we going to look for it? So that we intentionally have to forget our sacred origins, forget we're a soul, in order to set up the necessary conditions to see if one day we are going to be moved to commit to explore further stages of our evolutionary unfolding. And realize that we're not only a soul or a deeper self, but are part of the larger soul or deeper self of all of life. In other words, that we're part of the whole. So do you see this hide and seek game? I'll purposely hide myself inside you to see if you get so fed up with your life without me that you'll be motivated to come looking for me. Peekaboo. Because if you and I already knew who we were, already knew that we were one with our Creator, one with God, one with the abundance and divinity of all life, then there wouldn't be any game. There'd be no need for us to try to discover who we are. In other words, how can we out ourselves from the closet if we're already out? How can we be moved to seek something if that something is right there in the open and not hidden? There'd be no action, no dance to life, no exploration, no seeking. So the idea about soul needing to be hidden inside us is very significant. Because in life we need challenges. And this is the big challenge of life, isn't it? If life, and we see a great sage was asked, why is there evil in the world? And Ramakrishna said, to thicken the plot. In other words, if life was always easy and there were no wars, no dark forces to be confronted, no glamorous or seductive forces to pull us away, no psychological viruses to entangle and confuse us, there wouldn't be a game to life. All these obstacles serve to spice things up, make the sacred game more meaningful. And that's why you and I need to come into the world asleep to who we really are. And it's also why we have to face huge challenges in our lives, as in overcoming them, we gradually inch closer to being who we truly are. So the fact of our seeming to go through further falls, or we become entangled or lost in all the many soulless dramas going on around us, which we all seem to do. We get lost, confused. As a psychotherapist, I deal with people going through these issues all the time. It's not because we're weak and fallen, miserable sinners in need of extra punishment. It's all intentional, and we don't fall. We need to experience difficulties and get lost and lose sight of who we are and be confused, because that's the impetus behind our discovery. I mean, we wouldn't be on a spiritual path if we didn't feel lost. So of course, we have to separate from our oceanic, womb-like pre-personalness in order to enter the world and become a person and become an ego and journey into our separateness and go through further stages of becoming unaware or asleep to our own core divinity. Certainly, if I talk about my own life, it's been during those times when I felt most lost or most confused or most up against it or most stuck in a dark forest with trees all around me and there's no way out, that I've done most soul searching. The problem, however, is that many of us get seduced, we get trapped in our separative self-egoic identities. We remain there, we don't wake up. The pull of materiality and worldliness and the seductions of big things, of money and big houses and successful and whatever, our egos get inflated, they don't get smaller. And we don't respond to the game of peekaboo. The divine says, hi, come and look for me, and we turn away. It's like we hear I think it was Jesus who said that many are called, but few are chosen. And what he means by that is that the divine calls out to all of us in different ways. We have intimations inside us that there's more to life. We touch into a deeper love. But we don't choose to listen because we're too full of our own stuff to hear that still small voice of the divine calling to us from inside us. And so we stay embedded in the quagmire of the seductive system that tells us that there's nothing beyond three-dimensional space-time reality, and that the materialistic reality, i.e. what we can smell, touch, hear, etc., is all that exists. And we don't feel inclined to change anything. We prefer to stay asleep. We don't make the effort to give birth to the deeper us, i.e. a second birth. We're born into the world, the first birth. Then if we can be born again, and that's what the Christians talk about. Being a born-again Christian means that we find the divine inside us. But I think it was the Prophet Muhammad who once said that it's a real pity that so many people come into the world and they die before they've given birth to who they really are. So that is the nature of the game. of life. And soul calls to each of us in our different ways. But as I said, we don't always heed the call. We're too busy, we're too closed off, we're too entangled in our worldly pursuits and being important and rich and famous, or whatever it is that seduces us, because the world is full of seductions. And that's part of it. Are we going to be pulled into the seductions, or are pulled down into the seductions, or are we going to be pulled up to realize our deeper self? Being reminded that there's something more to life, something more mysterious and more beautiful than our mundane existence is normally revealed to us. Are we going to be entrapped by our comfort zones? And are they going to hold us hostage? Or are we going to make some radical shifts in our lives and begin to work on waking up to who we really are? And I think that that's why we're having a lot of crises in the world, because crises, if they don't obliterate us, and they can, they plunge us to the depth. And when we go deep down, we discover, we begin to awaken. And certainly in my own life, and I wrote about it in my memoirs that have just come out, Amazing Grace, I found that it was mainly when I was in crisis that my own spiritual awakening began to accelerate. And actually why I called my book Amazing Grace is because I do feel that grace or soul or spirit is always around us if we can just be sensitive enough to listen to it, to feel it, to hear it. Like being out in nature, or going or meditating, or going to prayer, or going on spiritual retreats. But as I said, the call to stay asleep, to believe that who we are is what our egos tell us we are, is very important. It's very strong. My ego tells me that I'm a father, I'm a psychotherapist, I'm a writer, I'm someone who used to be good at sport, I'm elderly. These are things about me, but they're not who I am, the true I am, the deep part of me. And I also want to say that even if our souls do begin to emerge out of hiding, and we do realize, yeah, I'm more than my ideas about ourselves. If we don't maintain this part of us, if we don't continue to look after our souls, or care for our souls, or live our life in a soulful and gracious and graceful way, in exactly the same way that if we're training for a sport and we don't sort of bother to keep fit, so our muscles stay strong, our muscles can atrophy, and the same with our souls. Our soul life can wither away, and we can come back into believing that we are a separate self. So we need to be living in a way we're being tested all the time, because we can fall down from grace. And if we want to continue to live more in terms of who we really are, as opposed to who we really aren't, we need, as I said, to work at prayer and meditation and trying to be kind to our neighbors and trying to find a way of being of service in the world and making a difference. And we need to do our best to have close encounters with the soulful forces. We need to evoke them. We need to live in a way that will attract healing and spiritual energies towards us. And what I mean by this is that if we're part of Trump world and we're in the MAGA clan, that is a way in order to most disconnect ourselves from the soulful forces, because it's a world of lying and deceit and fascism and cruelty and hatred and dishonesty, and the rich getting richer and the poor poorer. And if we're in that world, there's not going to be a lot of soul with us. And it's why I sometimes wonder why so many fundamentalist Christians have aligned themselves with Trump and see him as their savior. I see Trump as being their destroyer. But anyway, that's just what I feel. But anyway, we all lose our way at certain times. I've had times in my life that I felt completely lost. I don't know where I'm going, what's happening, but it may even motivate us to put more effort into our search. Now, I studied Sufism in my early 20s at a lovely center in Gloucestershire called Bashara. And I studied the thoughts of a 12th century Sufi mystic called Ibn Arabi. And speaking as if on behalf of God and referring to God as a treasure, he intimates why God created the world in these words: I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known, so I created the world that I might be known. I'm just going to repeat that. I was a hidden treasure. Said as if on behalf of God, I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known, so I created the world that I might be known. So it's in effect saying that treasureness or godness or soulness is intentionally hidden. But the divine loves to be known, loves its presence to be outed, desires that it be brought out of hiding or realized. And that's the whole point behind the creation of the world. The reason why you and I were created, why we've all come into being, is because as we embark on the journey of discovering who we really are, which occurs as we gradually grow in our humanity, we become more fully human. We become a space through which the divine can be known and discover new manifestations of itself. In other words, you and I are outposts, are potential outposts for the divine to come alive inside us and discover new manifestations of its divinity. Because a divine spark was implanted into each of us. And that divine spark is always inside us as a kind of memory that we're more than just this worldly ego self that we think we are. Is the divine spark going to turn into a flame and become a sacred flame? Are we going to be a space for God, for the divine feminine, the divine masculine, to celebrate its joy and love and altruistic faith through us, which happens as we open up and become a space for the consciousness, the divine consciousness implanted inside us to ignite. And when it does, the divine rejoices. And I'm saying that what allows the divine to come alive, to manifest, to rejoice, to be outed, is when you and I start to live our lives in a sacred way. We're gracious to our neighbors. We show altruism. We open our hearts in love to people. We do things that make a difference in the world. We create beautiful music that inspires people. We do wonderful paintings that enlightens people. Tolstoy will write War and Peace. Bach, his great B minor Mass. We think of the great art and the great cathedrals and the extraordinary manifestations in the world. These are extreme versions of the divine being outed. The Bhagavad Gita, the writing of the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Nag Hammadi Gospels, where we realize that Jesus was a terrific teacher of transformation. But it's not only in just the great things, us little people, in doing our tiny little kind things, being kind to the dog, by going out of our way to help a friend, those are also manifestations of the divine, and the divine also is happy and celebrates itself when we behave like that. So when I say teach one of my spiritual retreats, or when I'm working with my clients, or trying to be loving with my wife or daughter, I feel that higher power is with me and can celebrate a tiny sort of little bit of itself, even through a tiny little person like me. So we're all tiny little people in the great scope of things, but we're also enormous sort of forces of divinity because we're connected to the whole. And therefore, my friends, the whole will manifest through us. So when we find peace inside ourselves and we take stands against the oppressive forces, when we dare to express our truth, when we find a way to bring light into a dark space, or when we confront danger with love, or we give of our limited resources to help someone in trouble, or we feel moved to work towards ending conflict on the planet, then we are a space to allow the divine treasure that is hidden within inside us to be outed and to be known. I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known, so I created a world that I might be known. There's a beautiful Gnostic tale entitled The Hymn of the Pearl, and it's written in either the 1st or the 2nd century, in which our divinity or treasurehood is represented by a pearl. And it clarifies everything I've been talking about. So I'm going to, I've summarized the story, and I'm going to sort of read it out and then give a little explanation as we go along. So here's the story of the hymn of the pearl. When I was a little child and dwelt in the kingdom of my father's house in great wealth and splendor, i.e., before we're born and we live in soul connected to the whole. My parents sent me on a journey, and that's the journey of our incarnating into the world. So we come into the world. But first, they took off from me the robe of glory which they made for me, and made a covenant with me which they wrote inside my heart so I wouldn't forget it, i.e., they made me temporarily forget my divinity. But they put a little spark of it so that so that there would be a reminder somewhere, because they implanted it into me. And here's what my parents said: we want you to travel to Egypt and bring back the pearl which lies in the middle of the sea, which is encircled and protected by the snorting monster, i.e., we want you to discover your soulfulness in the middle of soullessness. And when you will have done so and come back, you can again put on your robe of glory. In other words, know that you're always one with a larger whole of life. So I left on my journey and went straight to the serpent and settled down close to him until he went to sleep. And then I could take the pearl from him. I dressed myself in the clothes of those around me in case they recognized who I was and what my mission was, fearing they might arouse the serpent against me. But instead they mixed me a certain drink and gave me some meat, and it made me fall asleep to my mission, i.e., we forget who we are. We forget that our mission in the world is to be a space for the divine to manifest through our humanity. And that's part of the whole game. So that by being born, it's as if we're all sort of given a narcotic drink to send us to sleep so that we forget who we really are. So the story goes on. I forgot I was a king's son. And we could also say that this is also for women as well. So I forgot that I was a king's son or a king's daughter, i.e., I forgot my inherent divinity. And I forgot that I'd come to take the pearl. In other words, to find soul in the midst of soullessness. And my parents noted what had happened, and they were sad. And they wrote a letter to me asking me to rise out of my sleep and remember who I was, remember that I was a king's son and a king's daughter, and to remember the pearl that I came to get, and remember the robe of glory that I used to wear. And the eagle, the symbol of soul and grace, brought the letter to me. And I read it, i.e., we get intimations of our divinity. I actually, very interestingly, was on a vision quest, and I was in a cave with snakes climbing up outside very close to me. And I thought I'm going to be bitten by this poisonous snake. But suddenly the memory came to me that I was one with all of the animals, and this snake was my brother. And suddenly I felt that, and my heart opened to the snake, and it went on climbing up, and I was fine. So a snake brought the letter of remembrance to me. But in this story, it's the eagle. So the eagle came and woke me up out of my sleep, and I remembered who I really was, the son and daughter of a king, and what my mission really was, to retrieve the pearl. In other words, to find soul out in the world of soullessness. So I set out and began to enchant the snorting serpent, and I charmed it to sleep by chanting the names of my father and mother. In other words, spiritual practices, meditating and chanting. And when we do that, the forces of soullessness begin to evaporate. And the story goes on, and I seized the pearl, i.e., I started to wake up to who I really was, and went home to my parents, casting off the filthy garments I had put on, i.e., I let go all my beliefs in and attachments to the egoic stories. The letter that had awakened me served as a light to guide me back home, i.e., when our soul light awakens in us, so too does our inner guidance. We get guided from within. And as I drew near home, my parents sent out my robe of glory and I put it on, i.e., I became a space for God to celebrate itself through me. And when I arrived, I bowed my head and adored the splendor of my father and mother who had sent it me and whose commands I had fulfilled, i.e., I'd woken up to realize who I truly was. Now, this story exists in various forms in different spiritual traditions, and it's often called the return journey because the more we begin outing our deeper soul self, the more we understand that we're actually not going to some foreign place, but are actually returning to that undifferentiated oneness, i.e., to our source. Only now we're experiencing being home in a conscious way, whereas when we were born, it was in a pre-conscious way. And here's our challenge, my dear, dear friends, my challenge and your challenge. Are we going to remain asleep and continue to live our old story existences as our egos tell us to, where the divinity inside us continues to slumber? Or will we choose to work at awakening and thus start celebrating who we truly are, and in so doing, we tune into our inner royalty, or our true divine self. And in so doing, we become a space for the healing of our society as well. Thank you, my dear friends. Think about this. If there's any way that I can help you, send me an email. I'd be happy to give you a free talk. If you feel moved, my email address is info, Serge, BB, SERGEBB @gmail.com. And if I can help you in some way, I'd be delighted to. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you feel happy and inspired. Goodbye.